Welcome to Sleepless Historian, the channel where history meets reflection. Tonight we step quietly into one of the most haunting realities of medieval life, the siege. Imagine being trapped behind cold castle walls, as days stretch into weeks and weeks into months. The bread is gone, the wells turn foul, and disease slithers through the narrow streets like smoke. You hear the distant hum of catapults, the whispers of fear, the cries of children who no longer remember what hope feels like. A medieval siege was not merely a battle of armies. It was a slow, suffocating test of hunger, endurance, and faith. Even the bravest spirits cracked long before the walls did. In this episode, we'll uncover why surviving such a siege was almost impossible, exploring the brutal blend of famine, plague, despair, and the human will to endure. Before we begin, take a deep breath, settle in, and let the night carry you. If these quiet journeys through the shadows of history speak to you, please like this video, subscribe to Sleepless Historian, and share where you're watching from. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive gently, truthfully, one story at a time. Exhaustion of food and provisions. The church bells rang in frantic bursts, not to summon people to morning prayer, but to sound the alarm. The heavy wooden gates slammed shut, iron chains locked into place, and every road leading outward was cut off. Crowds pressed together in the square. From this day forward, they and their city would be sealed behind stone. On the first day of a siege, fear is more a thrill than a terror. Soldiers along the walls still looked confident. Merchants still put out baskets of bread, salted meat, and cheese. But that safety was a thin mirage. Everyone knew there would be no more wagons loaded with grain, no more herds driven in from the fields. The food stored within the walls had become the city's ticking clock. By the 10th day, you saw the change clearly at market. The loaves of bread, once big and warm, had shrunk to half size, while prices doubled. A baker shrugged. "There isn't much wheat left. We have to stretch it." Mothers bought the last slices of salted meat fear, flickering in their eyes. Anxiety crept through alleys and doorways, just as it had in Jerusalem in 1099 when Crusaders ringed the city. There too, baskets emptied, day by day, until people chewed weeds and roots and boiled animal hides to keep breath in their bodies. By the 20th day, the sound of crying children drowned out the bells. Small bodies curled around aching stomachs. A father came home empty, handed, except for a few limp turnips. The distance between hunger and despair is small. In Rochester, in 1215, defenders endured much the same. When the salty meat ran out, they slaughtered their horses, pride of the garrison, to survive a little longer. When even the horses were gone, they boiled the hides, scraping off any sticky fat that clung. The picture in your city was no better families. Boiled, boot-leather ground animal bones into powder for thin gruel. By the 30th day, hunger had changed the city's face. In the darker corners, people bartered for things no one had imagined. Trading a leather belt for a few crumbs of bread, the family cat butchered in secret during the night. Sometimes even the sentries turned a blind eye, as crowds fought over sweepings spilled from the military storehouse. It wasn't just a literary image from a distant past. Constantinople, in 1453, faced this too. A glittering capital, cut off by land and sea, watched its people die, not from sword blows, but empty bellies. You felt yourself changing. Hunger does not merely hollow the body, it erodes the spirit. People stopped chatting, stopped singing hymns. They sat still, eyes glassy, listening to their own stomachs growl. The same strong guards, once steady with bowstring, trembled when they drew. Their fingers had lost their strength. The city's downfall would not come first from trebuchets or battering rams you realized, but from the blade that slices slowly from within starvation. You saw the earliest rationing begin. Officials sealed off storerooms and posted soldiers at the doors. Whispers grew into anger. The magistrates keep the best for themselves. Hunger makes every act look like theft. One evening, men gathered in the square, muttering that the rich still had salted pork and wine, while their children sucked on stale crusts. A spark of fury fed by gnawing stomachs passed through the crowd. On the 40th day, the city's noises dulled to a hush. Shop shutters hung crooked streets, echoed with thin footsteps, and corners smelled of old smoke and boiled nettles. The poor, gnawed leather softened in bitter water. You remember a small pot simmering in a courtyard. Inside it died shoelaces and belt scraps the broth, a sour brown that tasted of sweat and earth. People ate it anyway. Dignity is a luxury hunger does not afford. Rumours spread fast. One man swore he'd seen a family digging at night for roots where vines clung to the stone. Another whispered that a woman had sold her wedding ring for a handful of flour, then fainted before she reached home. The guards on the wall had begun to falter too. One slid down behind a merlon and did not rise. No arrow had struck him, only days of too little food. History didn't feel like history anymore. The tales of the First Crusade of Jerusalem, 1,099 of people gnawing bones, clean boiling belts and hides, no longer sounded like medieval exaggerations. They sounded like tomorrow. In a siege, the battle is not a sudden clash, but a long grey narrowing of options until there is nothing left to trade but the body's own reserves and the last scraps of mercy. And mercy was fading. A child across the alley cried at night until his voice broke into silent sobs. His mother, too weak to wail, stroked his hair in the darkness. Down in the barracks, a sergeant quietly ordered half rations, then quarter rations. He did not live long enough to give the next order. By the 50th day, hunger was everywhere, in the slump of shoulders, in the way people walked, bent as if the air itself were heavier. Someone had chalked a line beside the gate and scratched a date. Each day, the line flaked away in dust. That dust tasted like flour that would never be baked. The walls still stood, but the city behind them had begun to fall. By the 60th day, the city's sound changed. Not the clang of bells or the thud of stones, but a low chorus of pleading. A man offered a month's labour for a fistful of oats. A mother begged for a crust for her baby, her hands shaking. No one dared to look her in the eye. Hunger thrives in averted gazes. The wells drew up less water and more slime. Barrels set out for rain stayed dry for weeks. When a cloud burst finally came, people ran into the open mouths, tilted up to the sky like parched birds. They set out jars and bowls and cupped hands, scrambling for every drop. When the shower passed, crowding turned to shoving, then to fist fights over puddles in the cobbles. A man slipped, struck his head, and lay still, while others knelt in the mud to lick at the water he had nearly reached. The city tried to ration calmly. A proclamation allotted a small loaf per household, regardless of wealth. But hunger knows no fairness. The line turned into a crush. Someone fell and was trampled, still clutching his ticket. Blood darkened the stones, and no one stopped. Fear of losing one's place overpowered pity. Constantinople 1453 had seen this too. People clawing for the last sacks of grain as blockade and fear tightened like a garrity. Starvation was the real enemy. The army outside only waited to collect the surrender. Night closed on the city like a tight lid. Quiet houses held their breath. You lay awake listening to the timber groan in the cold, hearing the faint scrape of rats somewhere in the walls. Those rats would not live long. Hunger was clever and patient. It listened at the same walls, waiting for a moment of distraction. On the 70th day, the talk shifted from bread to bones. People brought old soup pots to the square and traded stories about the best way to render marrow crush. With a stone boil long skim, the slick fat take turns drinking the greasy broth. Children's mouths shone with the sheen of it. They slept for a while afterward, and for those mothers, sleep itself felt like victory. You had thought yourself braver than most, but then you passed an alley and saw something you will never fully forget. Two men crouched over something small and grey. A trapped rat. One had already bitten into it, the other snarled, reaching for the scraps. Their hands were slick, their eyes bright with a terrible light. You backed away and pressed your forehead to the wall. The stones were cold. Your stomach clenched and then horrifyingly growled. The soldiers were no longer the wall's guardians, but its burden-bearers. Armour hung loose on their frames. A captain gripped the crenellations and breathed hard, then slid down to sit with his back against the parapet, head bowed. He told you he still dreamed of roast meat and woke with tears in his eyes. You both laughed a dry, secret laugh, because the other choice was to weep. Stories crept through the streets like fog. Someone said a garrison at Orléans in 1428, 1429, had grown so faint they couldn't hold their swords. They slumped against the stones, waiting for English arrows to finish the work hunger had begun. Another whispered about a distant place called Ma'arat al-Numan in 1098, where people cornered by famine and fear had eaten human flesh. At first you dismissed it as morbid fantasy. Then one evening the rumour crossed a threshold. In a house near the church, a child cried, thin, ragged, weakening, and then stopped. A neighbour smelled something from the hearth, a deep, fatty scent, unlike leather or roots. She knocked, then pushed open the door. In the dim light, a mother knelt by a pot. She turned her face, and no language could carry what lived in her eyes. Shame, defiance, grief, beyond measure. There was no other way, she whispered. The neighbour staggered into the lane. By morning, the whole quarter knew. At first, the city shouted, "Lies, slander." But hunger is an attorney with endless exhibits. A man disappeared without a trace. A child failed to come home. A rumour hardened into a possibility, and then into a fact, and then into a method. The worst part was not that it happened, but that people began to understand it. On the 80th day, soldiers discovered a sack hidden under a floorboard, dried strips of something that once had been human. The squad looked at one another. One vomited. Another stared at the ceiling and bit his knuckle hard. The sergeant said nothing, wrapped the sack and carried it away. From then on, the patrols avoided that street. There are places hunger makes sacred by making them unbearable. Not everyone crossed that line. Many would rather starve. But lines blur under siege. You knew a father who traded his boots for a week's worth of mash for his children. He went barefoot in the frost, and then he didn't go at all. You knew an old woman who boiled lint from blankets, strained it through cloth, and drank the grey water. She died quietly, hands folded, as if in prayer. By the 90th day, the city lived inside a whisper. People spoke softly to save their strength. Footsteps sounded like paper rubbing on paper. From the wall you gazed across frozen fields. You could almost hear the enemy's patience. They didn't need ladders or rams. The famine would force the gates. On the 70th day you had thought you'd reached the bottom, but hunger finds trapdoors. By the 90th it had become a ritual wake measure. The crumbs count, the bowls move like a shadow between chores. that no longer made sense. A baker you once knew sat in his empty shop, turning a wooden peel in his hands as if it might transform into bread by touch alone. On the 100th day, the city council met. A ledger lay open, lists of stores, columns of dwindling figures, a few lines crossed out in despair. There was talk of a sortie to seize supplies. Someone suggested breaking through the enemy line at night. No one had the strength. The debates thinned into silence. Decisions require calories. In the square, a crowd gathered. Some screamed to open the gates rather than watch children die. Others insisted on holding out for relief that had never been promised. The arguments tasted like ash. A gaunt man shouted, "Better to die with a sword." A woman answered, "Better, my child lives as a servant than dies as a saint." Neither convinced the other. Hunger debates nothing, it decides. At night you dreamed of bread. A loaf round and golden cracked under your fingers. Steam rose like a blessing. In the dream you wept and ate and laughed all at once. You woke with teeth clenched around your own wrist, the taste of skin, the salt and bitter shame burning through you hotter than any fire. On the 110th day, the city's order gave way entirely. A ration cart toppled, and the press became a riot. People clawed at one another, bits screamed, then fell apart, panting. A boy you knew from the alley stood with a crust in his fist and a look on his face, like triumph and fear married together. You did not ask him to share. A few soldiers deserted their posts at night, trying to slip through a culvert to the fields. The next morning their bodies hung on the trees just beyond bowshot, the enemy's message clear. The figures swung in the wind. There is a kind of hunger that is not just of the body, it is a hunger for a future. The enemy starved that too. On the 120th day, you walked past a row of houses that had become tombs. Families too weak to bury their dead wrapped them and left them in alcoves, with candles burned down to nubs. The wax dripped onto the floor in shapes that looked like tears. You stepped carefully to avoid them, as if they were a kind of holiness. You thought of Montsegur in 1244, where hunger and fear folded into surrender, where children died first and graves were shallow. You thought of places the chroniclers wrote about, with hands that shook. Yet none of those pages could teach you how to look your neighbour in the eye and pretend you had not smelled what she had cooked. On the 130th day, an argument in the council at last found its terminal point. There were no secret caches left, no lost wagons to return, no miracle rains in the forecast of any profit. A decision hovered over everyone, like a hawk, surrender or starve to death within the week. In history, countless siege walls have fallen first inside the mind. Your city was no different. They chose what many had already chosen in their hearts. The chains were lifted from the gate. Soldiers who had once sworn to die where they stood now leaned their shoulders into the mechanisms and hauled because there was nothing left to defend but the bare fact of breathing. The gates opened. You did not run. You shuffled, swallowed by a tide of bodies that could hardly lift their feet. The enemy advanced warily, and then, seeing no resistance, confidently. A captain looked into the city and grunted work already done for him. You looked up at a sky washed pale, the colour of bone. No cheers, no cries, just the heavy silence of a city that had already died. You understood then, in a way no book can teach in a medieval siege, the sword is not the keenest killer. It is the hunger that arrives on the first day and never leaves, that eats courage and charity first, and only then eats the flesh. Long before stones fall or gates splinter, the people have been defeated in their bellies. And so it ended not with a final heroic charge, not with a last arrow fired from the wall, but with a slow descent, stair by stair, step by step, into a hunger so deep that even memory felt tired. You walked out under the open sky, carrying nothing but bones and the knowledge that the city had been broken long before the gate ever was. Disease and decay. By the time the 100th day passed, hunger was no longer the only enemy. A more insidious killer slipped into the city disease. It came quietly riding in on the stench of refuse, on the filth that accumulated, when no one had the strength to clean on the corpses left unburied in corners. Hunger hollowed the body, but disease finished the job. At first it was only whispers. A fever in one district, a cough in another. It's just weakness, some said. People are fainting from hunger. But hunger does not cause black swellings under the arms or sores that ooze or eyes glazed in fever. You remember walking past a hovel where a man lay gasping, his skin slick with sweat, his breath rattling. His wife crouched beside him, rocking back and forth, murmuring prayers that sounded like sobs. Soon the sickness spread. Entire alleys smelled of rot, even though no corpse had been laid there yet. The smell came from the living. They coughed and spat, their mouths flecked with blood. Children burned with heat, their mothers pressing cloths, soaked in what little water remained. The fevers climbed higher, screams turned into groans, then into silence. In one courtyard, a child's body was set out because his family had no strength to bury him. By evening, 3 more small bodies lay beside him. By dawn, the family was gone too. The plague was faster than starvation, and its scythe cut indiscriminately. You remembered the chronicles of the Black Death in the 14th century, when plague spread across Europe, claiming millions. In 1346, at Kaffa besieging Mongols, had flung infected corpses over the walls, turning the city itself into a plague pit. You never believed such horror could touch your city. Yet here you stood, stepping around bundles of rags that were once neighbours, praying you would not feel the same fire in your veins. The priests urged people to pray harder. Bells rang for processions, though only thin lines of faithful could stumble along the streets. Incense was burned, not just for devotion, but to mask the stench. Yet no prayer halted the disease. You saw a friar collapse mid-sermon, coughing blood onto the altar. Some called it divine punishment. Others whispered it was the enemy's curse, or the judgment for sins within the walls. One day you entered what passed for a hospital, though it was nothing more than a hall lined with pallets. The sight burned into your memory. Men and women lay tangled together, limbs, twisted eyes, staring glassy at the ceiling. The air was hot thick, with the stink of pus and waste. A boy no older than 12 shook with convulsions, foam flecking his lips before falling still. His mother wailed, then slumped dead beside him. No one moved her body. There was no strength left to mourn. Disease made the city feel haunted. Even the healthy looked over their shoulders, fearing invisible daggers. A cough in the crowd made people scatter. A sneeze silenced a gathering. Trust withered faster than crops in drought. You saw a family barricade their door and refuse to open even when their kin knocked. Better to die inside, the father said through the wood, than to let pestilence in. The grave diggers, once busy, now lay among their work. Pits meant to hold 10, filled with 20, then 50. Eventually people stopped digging altogether. Corpses piled in abandoned houses, in corners of streets, in cellars where families had tried to hide. Rats swarmed over them, and the rats too carried death. By the 120th day, the city no longer reeked, only of hunger, but of sweet cloying rot. You could smell death in the air before you saw it. Flies clouded around doorways. People walked with cloth pressed to their faces, though the fabric did nothing to keep out the odour or the plague. History had told you disease followed sieges, but you had never understood what that meant until now. In Tenochtitlan, 1521 smallpox had swept through at the same time as famine. Warriors who should have fought at the walls instead writhed in fever in their huts. A mighty empire fell not from Spanish swords, but from invisible contagion. Looking at your own city, you realized the same. The battle was already lost, long before the gates would open. And still the days dragged on. People no longer asked for bread. They asked if you had heard the latest toll of the dead. Numbers became the only language that mattered. A dozen gone in one alley, 50 in another. But numbers are only shadows. The real cost was in the eyes of the survivors, hollow, fearful, waiting for their turn. By the 130th day, death no longer waited at the city gates. It walked the streets openly. The hunger had weakened bodies until they were defenseless, and now the sickness devoured what little strength remained. Every alley carried the moans of the fevered. You could not pass a single lane without seeing a bundle of cloth with a face beneath it, breathing shallowly or not breathing at all. The water had turned foul. Wells once a source of life became pits of poison. People still drew from them, pinching noses against the stench, desperate for anything wet to soothe dry throats. Those who drank too much sickened faster. You saw a boy scoop water with shaking hands, gulp it down greedily, then vomit crimson. His mother screamed, holding him as he convulsed. By nightfall, he was still. No one trusted anyone anymore. Coughs sent people scattering. A neighbour pounding at the door might as well have been the knock of death itself. Families barricaded themselves in leaving sick members outside. Better one than all, they muttered. You heard shrieks of children begging to be let in, pounding tiny fists against wood, and still the doors did not open. The city had once rung with bells, for festivals, for saints' days, for victories. Now the bells tolled only for the dead, and they tolled constantly. Priests marched in processions, swinging censers heavy with incense. The sweet smoke curled through the streets, meant to drive away evil vapours. But it could not mask the stench of rotting flesh. You saw a friar stumble and fall blood spraying from his mouth, staining the ground where the censer lay. His brothers lifted him and carried him away, but by evening 3 of them were dead too. Inside the makeshift hospitals, chaos reigned. The sick lay pressed shoulder to shoulder, wheezing, coughing, crying out. Nurses and healers smeared herbs on wounds, muttered prayers, and fled before they could be touched. The floors ran with fluids, pus, bile, blood. You saw a woman clutching her daughter's body, shaking her as though she could rattle life back into her. But the girl's face was blue, lips cracked. Her eyes stared glassy at nothing. The mother screamed until her voice broke. Even soldiers were not spared. A garrison commander collapsed on the wall, racked with fever. His men lowered him down, but one by one they too began to fall. With so many too sick to stand, the walls grew thinly held. The enemy outside could see the slackening watch. They did not attack, they simply waited. Patience was their sharpest weapon. The rats grew bolder. No longer hiding in the shadows, they scurried across streets, feasting on the dead left unburied. Some were large, fattened, grotesquely by flesh. Children too weak to chase them watched silently, knowing those same rats carried the sickness in their teeth and fleas. History had warned of it. The Black Death had ridden into Europe on rat fleas, filling cities with the stench of mass graves. You remembered the illustrations, wagons piled with corpses, priests blessing rows of bodies. But you needed no book now. You had seen the wagons yourself, creaking through streets, heavy with the weight of neighbours and kin. The city's very air felt poisoned. People tied cloths over their mouths, soaked in vinegar or herbs, hoping to keep the plague at bay. Some carried posies of flowers, sniffing them constantly. The richer families burned barrels of pitch and resin outside their doors, filling alleys with acrid smoke. None of it worked. Death walked where it pleased unhindered. By the 140th day, whole districts had gone silent. Curtains drawn doors, locked no footsteps, no voices. When finally someone entered, they found houses stacked with bodies, entire families gone. A few survivors wandered the streets, dazed, too sick to know where they were. One man stumbled naked, covered in sores, moaning for water, before collapsing in the gutter. No one touched him. They waited until night to drag his body away. Rumours spread that the enemy was hurling plague corpses over the walls, as the Mongols had done at Kaffa in 1346. Whether it was true or not, fear made it real. People cursed the sky, cursed the enemy, cursed themselves. Some said the city was doomed not by hunger or swords, but by the wrath of God himself. The priests grew hoarse with chanting. Services became funeral processions in all but name. People crowded into the cathedral, begging saints for mercy, kneeling until their bones bruised. The air inside was thick with candle smoke and unwashed bodies, and still the disease spread. The altar itself seemed tainted. One morning you saw a child collapse in front of it, his body twitching violently before lying still. His mother screamed to heaven, but heaven did not answer. By the 150th day, the city had become a place where life and death blurred. The streets no longer carried the bustle of merchants or the chatter of children. They carried only silence, broken by an occasional groan or the scrape of a shovel moving earth. And even the shovels fell silent, for there were too many dead and too few living to bury them. You walked past a house with its door ajar. Inside candles still burned low, but the family lay unmoving. Father, mother, two children hands clasped as though they had prayed together before the fever took them. The wax had melted into long stalactites on the floor. The silence in that house was heavier than any cannonball. In another alley, a man stumbled barefoot, covered in sores. His skin had turned a purplish hue, as if bruised from within. He coughed, spraying blood, and reached out for help. People turned away, backing into doorways, whispering prayers under their breath. No one touched him. Within hours, his body lay where he had fallen. Flies already claimed him. The plague did not kill only bodies, it killed trust. People no longer embraced one another. Friends crossed the street rather than walk close. Families locked doors and spoke through cracks in shutters. A sneeze in the market sent crowds scattering like birds, startled by an arrow. The city had become a collection of islands, each person isolated in their fear. History repeated itself with cruel precision. You thought of Florence during the Black Death, when Boccaccio wrote that fathers abandoned sons, wives abandoned husbands, and no one dared to care for the sick, lest they too perish. Your city too was writing its own chronicle of abandonment. The graveyards overflowed. Trenches dug in haste, filled within days. Wagons creaked through the streets, piled high, with bodies, limbs, dangling eyes staring. At first priests blessed the dead, but soon there were too many. They hurried through prayers or gave up altogether. Corpses were dumped in pits without ceremony. Earth was shovelled over them like refuse. You passed one such pit and saw a child's small hand protruding from the soil, fingers curled as if still reaching. By the 160th day, hope had drained away. People no longer prayed for rescue or victory. They prayed only for release, for the suffering to end. Some whispered that surrender would save lives. Others said nothing could be saved. The sickness had hollowed the city out. Even if the gates opened tomorrow, what would be left? One evening, you sat by the wall staring at the horizon. The enemy's fires burned steadily in the distance. They did not need to attack. They had already won. Inside the walls, disease had accomplished what armies could not. You thought of Tenochtitlan in 1521, when smallpox and famine decimated the Aztecs before Spanish steel ever broke their lines. You thought of Kaffa in 1346 of corpses flung into the city to spread pestilence. Again and again history had shown that plagues were sharper than swords. In the cathedral, once a beacon of light candles sputtered out one by one. The pews were half empty, filled only with the desperate. The priest's voice trembled as he spoke of eternal rest, and in the pauses between his words you heard the rasp of the dying. Faith flickered like the candles still present, but fading. By the 170th day, entire quarters of the city lay abandoned. Doors banged open in the wind, cats prowled over corpses, rats feasted openly, growing fat on human flesh. The smell was unbearable, sweet, sickly, clinging to hair-clothed skin. No amount of washing could erase it. You realized the city itself had begun to rot like a carcass left in the Sunday. And then came the silence. The bells no longer tolled. There were no priests left to ring them. No one had strength to mourn. The city was not conquered in battle. It had simply withered, crumbled, fallen into stillness. You looked out from the wall one last time and thought this was never a fight between men and men. It was a fight between men and hunger men, and pestilence men and themselves. And in that fight the city had lost long before the enemy ever stepped through the gate. Psychological fear and the collapse of spirit. Fear does not arrive with the first stone hurled by a catapult or the first arrow whistling through the air. Fear arrives quietly long before the enemy breaches the walls, long before swords cross. It slips into the city like a draught through a crack spreading from whisper to whisper until it seeps into every heart. By the 100th day, hunger and disease had done their work. Yet what crushed the people even more than their hollow stomachs was the terror of what tomorrow might bring. Fear hung in the streets like a fog. People spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the walls as though the enemy could hear through stone. Children, once noisy, sat silently watching their parents' faces. They did not need to be told. Their parents' fear taught them everything. You remember the way silence filled the city. A dropped cup clattered like thunder. A shout in the market drew angry. Stares not because of the words, but because it pierced the fragile quiet everyone clung to. The city had become a place of whispers and lowered eyes. Soldiers on the wall still stood, but their gazes drifted. They looked outward, yes, but also inward, toward thoughts of families starving behind them, of enemies, waiting beyond. Their hands trembled when they gripped their weapons. Fear had crawled up the battlements, as surely as the vines. One night you dreamed of ladders scraping against stone. You woke with your heart racing only to realize there had been no attack. Yet you were not alone. Many neighbors told the same story. Dreams of breaches of fire, of screams. Even in sleep, fear gnawed at the people. And the enemy knew this. They did not hurl stones every night. Sometimes they sat silent, their campfires glowing in the dark fields. That silence was worse than bombardment. People stood on the walls and watched those fires, imagining the men behind them, sharpening blades, stringing bows, whispering plans. The stillness made imaginations run wild. In that silence, fear grew monstrous. Rumors fed it. One day someone whispered that reinforcements would never come. Another swore he saw traitors sneaking messages to the enemy. A child insisted she had overheard soldiers planning to desert. No one could prove anything, but proof wasn't needed. Fear made every rumor feel like truth. You thought of Carcassonne in 1209, when the citizens surrendered, not because the walls had fallen, but because terror had rotted their resolve. Chroniclers wrote that the people felt already defeated in their hearts. That same invisible collapse crept into your city. Fear twisted the air. It was not just fear of death, but fear of betrayal, fear of what awaited if the gates finally broke. Mothers whispered about their daughters what would happen if soldiers poured in. Fathers clutched their sons, wondering if they would be cut down as examples. Every imagination painted darker pictures than reality could yet supply. The enemy understood this better than any weaponsmith. They paraded prisoners within sight of the walls, executed them slowly, letting screams carry on the wind. They displayed severed heads on stakes, leaving them to rot in the Sunday. The message was clear. This will be you. And you saw the way people looked at those heads, the way they turned away and shuddered. The flesh rotted, but the fear endured. It endured in children's nightmares, in the tightening of every stomach, in the hollow quiet that grew deeper each day. Fear began to change faces. Where once neighbours had nodded and greeted one another, now they stared with suspicion. Who might be the traitor? Who might be hoarding food? Who might already be bargaining with the enemy for survival? Hunger made stomachs ache, but fear made hearts rot. In the marketplace, whispers became accusations. A woman was dragged before the crowd, accused of hiding bread. They found nothing in her house, yet suspicion clung like a stench. Her neighbours avoided her crossing themselves when she walked past. It did not matter that she was innocent. Fear had condemned her already. You remember the nights most clearly. Nights when the enemy remained silent. No catapults, no arrows, no shouts, just the flicker of their campfires. It was then that the mind worked against itself. The stillness outside became more terrifying than battle. People imagined ladders being built, tunnels dug, secret gates betrayed. The silence pressed down like a heavy hand. Even in dreams, the city could not escape. Children woke screaming of soldiers storming into their rooms. Mothers dreamed of their daughters torn away. Fathers saw visions of fire consuming their homes. Dreams and waking hours blurred together, both filled with dread. Soldiers tried to keep order, but they too were afraid. Some patrolled, with eyes darting into the shadows, clutching weapons too tightly. Others grew reckless, shouting bravado in the square, boasting of holding the walls forever, but their voices cracked, betraying them. You realized fear wears many masks: silence, suspicion, false, bravado, despair. And history whispered reminders. In Magdeburg 1631, the people's spirit broke long before the final storming of the walls. Chroniclers said fear spread like fire, and when the assault finally came, resistance collapsed. Not because weapons were lacking, but because will had already crumbled. The enemy understood this. They taunted from outside, shouting promises of mercy if the gates opened, threats of horror if they did not. Sometimes they catapulted letters into the city, scrawled with warnings. No one will be spared. The letters spread faster than plague. People gathered in corners, reading them aloud in trembling voices. Words did what swords could not. They planted surrender in the heart. The council tried to reassure the people, swearing reinforcements would arrive, that relief was on its way. But their voices carried little weight. When the people looked into their eyes, they saw the same fear reflected. The leaders no longer inspired, they lied, and the people knew it. One evening you walked along the wall and saw a guard staring outward, tears cutting tracks down his dirt-streaked face. He whispered to himself over and over, "I don't want to die here." You turned away, ashamed to have overheard, but you knew you had thought the same words. Everyone had. By the 150th day, fear was a sickness all its own. It clung to the skin, seeped into the bones. People no longer feared death in battle. That at least was quick. They feared what came before starvation, betrayal, humiliation. Families fought among themselves. A father insisted they hold out for honor. A mother wept that survival mattered more than glory. A son accused his father of cowardice. A daughter screamed that none of it mattered because they would all die anyway. These arguments ended in silence, each retreating into their own shadows, trust broken even within households. You remember one man who climbed the bell tower and shouted that the city was doomed. He screamed that no army would come, that God had abandoned them. Panic spread like wildfire. People rushed to the square, demanding answers, shouting for surrender. Guards dragged the man down, beat him bloody, and locked him away. But the damage was done. His words had already taken root. Fear hollowed out religion too. Priests preached that God tested them, but the people looked around at the dead, at the disease, at the hunger, and whispered, "What kind of God is this?" Churches emptied. Some turned to strange rituals, burning herbs, chanting in tongues, scratching charms into the walls. They searched for any shield against fear. None worked. And all the while, the enemy fed the fire. They paraded captives within sight, executed them slowly, letting screams echo into the city. They displayed severed heads on spikes, faces, familiar neighbours and kin. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, but too late. The images burned themselves into young minds, into nightmares that lasted long after sleep. You thought of Harfleur 1415, where fear of English brutality made the defenders collapse after only weeks, though their walls still stood. Chroniclers wrote that women begged the men to surrender, fearing rape and slaughter. The walls were strong, but fear had already breached them. The same was happening now. Women whispered to each other in the corners of houses, clutching daughters tightly. Men avoided one another's eyes, ashamed of their own thoughts of surrender. The air itself seemed poisoned with despair. By the 160th day, fear had become heavier than hunger, more suffocating than disease. Hunger gnawed at the belly, disease burned the flesh, but fear clouded the mind. And without the mind, nothing else mattered. In the barracks, soldiers whispered of desertion. Some had families outside the walls. Others simply wanted to flee anywhere, even into the enemy's arms. One night a group tried to slip away through a sally port. They were caught. The punishment was brutal. Hanged at dawn, their bodies displayed as warning. Yet the whispers continued. Civilians too broke down. Some barricaded doors, hiding from both friend and foe. Others wandered the streets, muttering that it was all over. Children clung silently to their mothers' skirts, eyes wide and hollow. Silence became the city's true anthem. You remember standing in the square when a messenger arrived. He brought no reinforcements, only silence. The council tried to hide it, but word spread. No one was coming. Fear hardened into certainty. The enemy had to do nothing but wait. And then the visions began. People claimed to see omens, black birds circling the cathedral's strange lights over the walls, shadows moving where none should be. Fear creates its own ghosts. The city became haunted, not just by hunger and disease, but by imaginations twisted by terror. You thought of Magdeburg 1631 again, where survivors wrote that terror made people mad, that they wandered as if drunk before the final assault. Looking at your neighbours, you saw the same eyes, unfocused steps, stumbling words disjointed. Fear had stripped away sanity. By the 170th day, the city had already surrendered, though the gates remained closed. The people no longer believed in victory. They no longer believed in deliverance. Fear had stolen everything: strength, faith, reason. When the enemy finally pressed closer, when the ladders rose, resistance was half-hearted. Some soldiers still fought, but many simply dropped their weapons. The walls had not fallen, the hearts behind them had. You watched as neighbours fled their posts, as families huddled in corners waiting for the end. Fear had become the true conqueror. The enemy did not win with steel. They won with silence, with rumours, with the steady drip of dread that wore away courage drop by drop. History would not remember these people as heroes. Chroniclers would write of cowardice, of weakness. But you had lived it, and you knew the truth. No wall can withstand fear forever. Hunger and disease weaken the body, but fear poisons the soul. And once the soul collapses, no city can stand. In the end, the fall was not marked by a final clash, but by a sigh, by the lowering of eyes, by doors opening not from force, but from despair. And you realized, in a siege, the greatest enemy is not the army outside, but the terror within. The collapse of social order and violence within the walls. By the 180th day, hunger and sickness were no longer the only tormentors. The city itself had begun to unravel. When people lose food, they suffer. When they lose trust, they rot. But when they lose order, they become something less than human. The first cracks showed in the markets. There had been lines once ragged but still orderly. Now there were mobs. Rations already pitifully small disappeared before they were handed out. Guards tried to control the crowds, but the crowd turned on them. Sticks, stones, bare fists, it didn't matter. One guard was beaten to the ground, his ration cart overturned. Flour burst into the air like smoke, and people fell to their knees in the dust, licking at the ground. In the alleys the poor turned on the less poor. Houses were broken into cupboards, ransacked. One evening you saw neighbours dragging a man out into the street, accusing him of hiding food. He denied it, but denial meant nothing. They tore apart his house. When they found nothing, they tore him apart instead. His screams echoed down the lane, then stopped. Fear had grown teeth, and hunger had sharpened them. By the 190th day, gangs ruled entire districts. Young men too restless to starve, quietly banded together, clubs in hand, knives stolen from kitchens. They demanded payment for protection, though everyone knew what protection meant. They took food if they found it, and blood if they didn't. Women avoided the streets, children hid indoors. The city's laws, once etched on parchment, had become meaningless scratches. The council tried to restore order. They sent soldiers to patrol, but soldiers were men too hungry, weak, angry. Some joined the gangs, others simply stood aside, unwilling to risk their lives for a magistrate's order. Justice had died quietly strangled by hunger, replaced by the law of the strongest. You thought of Magdeburg in 1631, when survivors told of neighbours, killing neighbours even before the walls fell of streets, filled with corpses, not from the enemy, but from each other. The same was happening now. You could see it in the way people eyed one another, not with kindness, not even suspicion, but with calculation. Are you stronger than me? Do you have food I can take? One afternoon, you watched two families clash in the square. The object of their rage, a single sack of rotting barley. They fought with sticks, with fists, with teeth. In the end, the sack split, the barley spilled into the dirt, and they scrambled like animals clawing for the spoiled grain. Both families left bloodied, half of them unable to walk. The barley was gone, trampled into mud. The shame lingered long after. The nights became worse. Without guards to keep watch, gangs prowled freely. Houses were broken into, women dragged out, cries piercing the dark. Men who resisted were cut down. You lay awake listening every sound, a knife in the silence. Fear of the enemy outside had been replaced by fear of neighbours within. And always the hunger drove it. Every theft, every murder, every scream came back to the same hollow ache in the belly. But even hunger could not explain everything. There was cruelty too. Men who struck harder than they needed to, who laughed at the weak, who discovered in the city's collapse a freedom darker than chains. You thought of Harlech Castle, where years of siege reduced defenders to shadows of men, and of the stories whispered later that some within the walls turned on each other, driven mad not only by want but by despair. You realized that starvation was not just emptiness, it was transformation. The city was no longer one community. It had become factions, each clawing at survival, each willing to spill blood for crumbs. The streets echoed with footsteps at night, and every creak of timber made you wonder if it was your turn next. By the 200th day, the city felt more like a battlefield inside its walls than outside. Every street corner was contested ground. The gangs had grown larger, organised almost like small armies of their own. They carried banners torn from household cloth, painted with crude symbols. They shouted their allegiance in the streets, daring others to challenge them. Merchants who still had scraps of wealth bought protection by feeding these groups. Poorer families were forced to swear loyalty to whichever gang controlled their district. If they did not, their homes were looted. Mothers wept as their children were taken hostage for food that never came. The council's authority evaporated. Edicts were proclaimed, but no one listened. Even the city guards answered to gang leaders. When one magistrate ordered a crackdown, his house was set ablaze that very night. His charred body was found the next morning, a warning to others who thought words could still command respect. The cathedral, once sacred, became a fortress. Priests hoarded supplies given for the poor and hired armed men to defend them. People whispered that God's house had become another gang stronghold. Worshippers were turned away unless they brought offerings of food. A mother knelt at the steps, with her starving child begging for mercy. The doors stayed shut. By the 210th day, violence was everywhere. You remember the sound most clearly: shrieks, echoing down alleys, the crash of doors, splintering the metallic clang of pots and pans, stolen the dry crack of clubs on bone. No longer did people hide their brutality. It was performed in the open in daylight, as though shame had been erased from human memory. History warned of this. In Montségur, 1244 chroniclers wrote of the besieged turning on one another in desperation, accusing neighbours of treachery, punishing imagined sins with real blood. In your city, too, accusation became execution. People were dragged to the square and beaten for whispering about surrender, for allegedly hiding grain for nothing more than being weak. One evening, you witnessed a woman accused of hoarding. She screamed that she had nothing, but the mob swarmed her house anyway. They found scraps, bones boiled until brittle, a handful of nettles. That was enough. They killed her in her own doorway. The sight of her body swinging from a rope outside her window silenced the street. Fear of the enemy had become fear of one another. At night, the gangs held feasts, not of abundance, but of stolen scraps. They roasted rats on spits past cups of thin broth. They cheered as though they were kings lords of this new order. For those nights their laughter drowned out the silence of the rest of the city. You lay awake listening, hating them, fearing them, and knowing you might join them if only to survive. By the 220th day, the social fabric had dissolved completely. The city no longer had one law, one people. It had fractured into tribes. Some districts were ruled by gangs, but others turned inward, creating small militias of neighbours. Men with farming tools stood guard at alley entrances, barring outsiders. Families pooled food and defended it with violence. The sound of clashing iron was no longer from siege engines outside, but from kitchen knives wielded inside. In one quarter, people carried torches at night, not to light the streets, but to burn rival houses. Entire families fled, stumbling barefoot into the dark, only to be cut down as they ran. The firelight painted the sky orange, and you smelled the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh together. The council vanished into obscurity. No one knew if its members still lived. Rumour said some had fled, others had been killed, a few hid in basements like rats. Their names were curses whispered in the dark. The idea of central authority was gone. Priests once, shepherds of souls, split between factions. Some blessed gangs before raids, others hoarded relics and gold, hoping to buy safety when the gates finally opened. A few still prayed honestly, but their voices were drowned by cries for vengeance, for survival, for blood. The greatest violence was not against enemies, but against the weakest. Old men beaten for crusts of bread. Women stripped of their meagre belongings, sometimes worse. Children scavenging in gutters chased off with stones. You remember seeing a boy, no older than 8, clutching a turnip to his chest, his eyes wide with terror as grown men lunged for it. He vanished into the alley, but you never saw him again. You thought of Paris during the siege of 885-886, when famine led to riots inside the walls. Chroniclers wrote of the city tearing itself apart from within, even as Vikings threatened without. Your city was no different. The enemy did not need to fight. The people were destroying themselves. The streets grew thick with corpses, not just the starved or diseased, but the murdered. Blood ran in the gutters. No one bothered to bury them anymore. The living stepped over the dead, as though corpses were merely another obstacle. Flies hummed constantly, a song of decay. And yet, in the midst of horror, some clung to hope. A few households barred their doors, huddled together, whispering prayers, sharing scraps in silence. Their survival depended not on strength, but on invisibility. They became shadows, hoping to outlast the storm of violence. By the 230th day, despair had become savagery. The city looked less like a community and more like a cage of beasts. Murders were no longer hidden, they were staged. In the squares, gangs executed rivals, leaving bodies to rot as warnings. People gathered to watch, not out of cruelty, but because spectacle was the only distraction from hunger. The human heart had grown numb. Blood spilled became entertainment. You saw one such execution. A young man accused of stealing food was tied to a post. His captors taunted him, forcing him to confess crimes he had not committed. They beat him until his voice failed, then killed him slowly. The crowd murmured, some cheering, others silent, but none intervened. You turned away, bile rising in your throat, but the sound of his screams followed you down the street. The cathedral bells had long since stopped ringing. Now they tolled only when gangs decided to summon people as though mocking their original purpose. What had been sacred was now profane. Even God's house was no longer a refuge, but a throne of fear. One night, a gang stormed into your quarter. They demanded food, but there was nothing left. They searched every house, every loft, every cellar. When they found nothing, they turned their rage on the people themselves. A neighbour was dragged out beaten until his body was unrecognizable. His wife wailed, clutching his broken frame. The gang left laughing, leaving blood pooling in the street. You thought of Constantinople 1453, where some chroniclers wrote that in the final days citizens looted their own city, tearing down doors and furniture to feed fires, robbing churches of relics. Your city mirrored that chaos. Desperation turned inward, destroying everything once sacred. The nights grew unbearable. Fires burned constantly, smoke choking the air. Screams rose and fell like waves. You could not sleep. Even if you closed your eyes, the sounds forced them open again. Every night felt like the end of the world, and through it all the enemy camped outside, silent, patient. They needed no assault. The city was killing itself more efficiently than any siege engine ever could. By the 240th day, the city was no longer a city. It was a ruin, still standing. The streets were littered with bodies, the walls manned by skeletons in armor. Smoke hung in the air, the scent of rot never fading. The gangs had devoured one another, until only the strongest remained. But even they grew weak. Their laughter had turned hollow. Their feasts of rats and scraps no longer satisfied. Their eyes were haunted, knowing the end approached. The common people were shadows. They moved quickly, silently clutching what little they had. Some hid in cellars and prayed to be overlooked. Others gave themselves up, wandering to the gates, hoping the enemy would show more mercy than their neighbours. When at last the final assault came, there was little resistance. The walls, still tall and strong, were scarcely defended. Inside there was no unity left, no order, no courage. The gates might as well have been opened already. The city had fallen long before. You remembered Magdeburg, 1631, where the sack left 20,000 dead, not only by enemy swords, but by chaos within. You remembered Jerusalem, 1099, where crusaders entered to find not just defenders, but civilians already destroyed by hunger and madness. Your city had joined their ranks. Another example in history's long record of places that died before the walls were breached. In the end, you understood hunger starves, the body disease rots the flesh, but it is violence within that destroys the soul of a city. A wall can stand for centuries, stone against storm and siege, but it cannot stand against the hands of its own people tearing each other apart. When the gates finally opened and the enemy marched in, they found no proud defenders, no last stand. They found ruins, blood silence. They found a city that had already consumed itself. And you realized then, with horror and clarity, the greatest enemy of any siege is not outside the walls, it is inside them. The slow death of hope and faith. By the 250th day, hope itself began to rot. Hunger disease and violence had ravaged the city, but there still lingered a faint belief that help might arrive, that God might intervene, that endurance might yet be rewarded. That belief was the last thread holding people together, and one by one, even that thread began to snap. At first, hope flickered in the promises of leaders. The council swore relief armies marched toward them. Messengers spread tales of banners on the horizon of kings preparing to send aid. People whispered these rumours to their children, to themselves, like charms against despair. But the days passed, and no banners appeared. The horizon stayed empty. The promises soured into lies. You remember standing on the walls at dawn, scanning the fields. Every sunrise painted the sky gold, but no allies came riding. The fields remained barren, littered only with the enemy's patient camps. The emptiness became unbearable. It was not just the absence of help, but the silence of it. Silence from the world beyond the walls. Silence from God himself. Priests tried to kindle faith. They rang bells though their arms trembled with weakness. They led processions, voices cracked and hoarse. They promised divine reward for suffering, urged people to hold fast. But their words rang hollow. The faithful looked at corpses piled in the squares, at children starving at the endless wait, and whispered, "Where is God now?" The cathedral had once been a sanctuary. Now its doors closed more often than they opened. Priests hoarded food as offerings, feeding themselves while the poor starved at the steps. Candles burned, but prayers dimmed. You remember one woman clutching a crucifix so tightly it cut her palm. Blood dripped onto the stone floor as she begged for her child's life. The child died that night. Her faith died with him. And still some clung desperately to hope. Families kept scraps of food hidden not just to survive, but to preserve the illusion of tomorrow. Mothers told their children bedtime stories of harvest fields, of warm bread, of safety. Fathers lied that soldiers were coming soon, that the gates would hold until rescue arrived. But children grew too wise. Their hollow eyes said they no longer believed. You thought of Rochelle in 1627, 1628, when the Huguenots held out for months praying for allies who never came. Chroniclers wrote that faith decayed day by day, that hope starved faster than flesh. Your city mirrored that slow erosion. The streets themselves seemed to mock belief. Where once hymns echoed, now only silence reigned. Where once processions of saints inspired, now gangs ruled with clubs. The sacred had been profaned. God's absence was heavier than any enemy. At night you lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. Hunger gnawed, but worse was the emptiness in your chest, where hope had lived. You whispered prayers. You no longer believed not to summon aid, but to hear the sound of your own voice in the silence. By the 260th day, faith had become bargaining. People no longer prayed with certainty. They pleaded like beggars, offering promises they could never keep. A woman swore to walk barefoot to a holy shrine if her son recovered from fever. A man vowed to give away his wealth if his wife survived the sickness. Neither lived. Their promises died in the same silence that had swallowed all others. Priests themselves faltered. You remember one who had thundered sermons of courage in the early weeks. Now he sat slumped on the cathedral steps, robe torn whispering psalms, with lips too cracked to speak clearly. His eyes were empty, his hands trembling. Faith had not only failed the people, it had failed its keepers. Rumours spread that God had cursed the city, that their suffering was punishment for sins hidden and unknown. Some turned against their neighbours, accusing them of witchcraft, of heresy, of drawing divine wrath. Women were beaten in the square for imagined crimes. Men were stoned for whispers spoken in dark alleys. Despair turned faith into cruelty. And yet a small number turned the other way. They clung to fanaticism, believing suffering itself was holy. They paraded half-naked through the streets, whipping their own backs until blood ran. They wailed hymns, crying that each lash would shorten the siege, that each drop of blood brought mercy. Children watched wide-eyed as their parents bled in front of them, confused and terrified. You thought of the flagellants during the Black Death, marching through Europe in lines of misery, begging forgiveness from a God who seemed absent. Your city had birthed its own flagellants, and their cries joined the endless chorus of despair. The cathedral grew emptier. Where once it overflowed with prayers, now only a handful knelt inside. The air smelled not of incense, but of mildew and rot. Candles sputtered, barely lighting the gloom. The priests' voices cracked their words, falling flat. Faith had become a hollow echo in an empty hall. At night, when the wind blew through the broken shutters, you thought you heard those echoes yourself. They mingled with the cries of the starving, with the coughs of the dying, until you could not tell prayers from groans. Both rose to the heavens, and both went unanswered. By the 270th day, hope shifted into delusion. People told themselves stories not because they believed them, but because silence was worse. You heard tales of tunnels dug beneath the walls, leading to freedom. You heard of secret allies approaching armies just beyond the hills. You heard of miracles waiting at dawn. Each story spread fast, repeated, in whispers, growing more absurd with each telling. By the next morning, they collapsed into dust. No allies came. No tunnels existed. No miracles arrived. Children no longer played. They sat in corners, thin arms wrapped around knees, eyes dull. They had stopped asking questions. Once they asked, "When will the soldiers come?" Now they said nothing at all. Their silence was heavier than tears. In some houses, families gathered to sing. Their voices were weak, but they clung to melodies as if notes could bind them to life. The songs drifted out windows, thin and trembling. Sometimes neighbours joined in, sometimes not. But even those songs faded. As voices died, so did hope. You thought of Masada in 73 CE, where Jewish rebels besieged by Rome chose death rather than capture. Chroniclers wrote that despair and loss of faith in deliverance made them take their own lives. You wondered if your city would meet the same fate not from swords, but from surrender to hopelessness. The priests no longer promised rescue. They muttered of judgment, of eternal rewards of endurance, but no one listened. People had grown deaf to sermons. When a priest raised his hands to bless a crowd, the crowd dispersed. Blessings no longer filled bellies. One evening, you found yourself standing in the cathedral. Light filtered through broken glass, scattering colours across cracked stone. You knelt, but no words came. Your mouth opened, but silence spilled out. Faith had died within you too. By the 280th day, hope was gone, faith was gone. Only ritual remained, performed by habit empty as dry husks. People still lit candles, but without meaning. They still made the sign of the cross, but without belief. They still whispered prayers, but only because silence was unbearable. Hope had not merely weakened, it had withered. Despair grew into resignation. People stopped searching the horizon. They stopped asking about rescue. They stopped pretending. They moved like shadows, fulfilling chores by reflex, waiting for the end. One night, a group of citizens gathered in the square. They held no weapons, no torches. They simply sat together, staring at the sky. When asked why, they said they wanted to see the stars one last time. Their words spread through the city a whisper of finality. It was not rebellion, not faith, but surrender to despair. The enemy outside knew this. They intensified their taunts, shouting promises of mercy if the gates opened. Their voices carried clearly in the thin air. Some citizens leaned from the walls listening. Some wept. A few shouted back, not with curses but with pleas. Will you feed us? By the next morning, people debated openly, not whether to surrender, but when. Hope had died so completely that resistance no longer seemed possible. Even the strongest voices could not stir courage. You thought of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when defenders broken by hunger and despair argued fiercely among themselves. Some wanted to resist to the death. Others longed for peace at any cost. That division destroyed them more thoroughly than Roman swords. Your city too, now fractured along the fault line of despair, by the 290th day, hope had become a memory. People spoke of it as though it were a person who had died long ago. Children no longer cried, they simply lay still. Women no longer prayed, they sat in silence. Men no longer shouted, they stared into the distance. Faith and hope, once the lifeblood of the city, had dried up. When the gates finally opened, it was not from courage or strategy, but from emptiness. The people had nothing left to give. Hunger had taken their strength disease, their health violence, their safety, but despair had taken their souls. The enemy marched in without resistance. They found no proud defenders, no burning faith, no desperate hope. They found only silence. The city had already surrendered in its heart. You realized then that the slowest death in a siege is not of the body, but of the spirit. Walls can stand, bellies can endure, even flesh can survive. But once hope dies, nothing remains. And so the city's story ended not with battle cries or flames of glory, but with silent surrender and the extinguishing of the last candle of faith. Desperation and the price of survival. By the 300th day, survival had become something darker than endurance. It was no longer about holding on for help or keeping faith, or even waiting for the enemy to relent. It was about clawing for another day, another hour, another mouthful of anything that could pass for food. Survival had shed its dignity and revealed its cost. You saw it first in the eyes of mothers. They once sang to their children whispered promises of better days. Now they whispered nothing at all. Their eyes followed scraps like hawks, their arms tightening protectively when others drew near. They did not ask for help. They no longer believed in it. They knew that survival meant taking, not sharing. One morning you watched as two families fought over a dead rat. They tore at each other with hands, nails, teeth. Blood streaked their faces as they screamed, each clutching a piece of the carcass. When it was over, one man lay unconscious, another limped away, and the rat was gone. Children stood in the shadows, wide-eyed, as though watching beasts in a pit. The gang still roamed, but even they had grown thin and ragged. Their strength lay not in abundance, but in ruthlessness. They demanded food even when they knew none remained. Payment was no longer bread or meat, but obedience labour flesh. A woman was dragged from her home in your quarter one night. Her cries echoed until dawn. The next day she was gone, and her family had no food left anyway. You thought of Marat al-Numan in 1098 during the First Crusade, when chroniclers wrote that starvation drove people to unthinkable acts, cannibalism, whispered in horror survival at the cost of humanity. You had dismissed it once as medieval exaggeration. Now you believed. The council no longer functioned. Authority lay only in those with power to hurt. Some traded what little they had jewelry heirlooms, even family members for crumbs. You saw a man sell his daughter to a gang for a sack of spoiled grain. He wept as he did it, but he ate that night. By the 310th day, survival was measured in compromises. Do you share your last scrap with your child, or eat it yourself to live longer? Do you protect your neighbour and risk your own life, or turn away? Do you cling to dignity, or do you surrender it for another day of breathing? These were not hypothetical questions. They were choices made in alleys, in cellars, in whispers. And every choice left scars. The city was no longer filled with people. It was filled with survivors, each carrying the cost of what they had done. By the 320th day, desperation had become the city's only law. People no longer asked what was right or just. They asked only what might keep them alive until morning. You saw neighbours steal from one another openly. A loaf of bread hidden in a cellar brought knives flashing in the dark. Children learned to lie, to sneak, to scavenge in silence. They grew cunning with speed that frightened even their parents. One boy you knew used to chase pigeons in the square. Now he crouched in shadows, eyes darting hands, quick to snatch. He was no longer a child, he was a survivor. The gangs demanded new forms of tribute. When no food remained, they demanded labour. Families were forced to dig latrines to carry corpses to build barricades. Those who refused were beaten or killed. For women, the tribute was worse. Desperation stripped away the last protections of shame. You heard the screams at night and pressed your hands to your ears, but it made no difference. One evening, you saw a man stumble into the square with blood on his hands. He held something wrapped in cloth, trembling. People whispered that he had killed his neighbour for a crust. He did not deny it. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal the scrap hard and mouldy. He ate it there, in front of everyone, tears streaming down his face. No one stopped him. No one condemned him. They only watched because every one of them had considered the same. By the 330th day, death was no longer feared. It was bartered. People spoke of it like a coin. Better to die quickly, some said, than to starve. Others sought ways to hasten the end, slipping into alleys and never returning. Hope had fled, but survival lingered, grim and animal. History whispered again. You remembered Harlech Castle in the 1,460 seconds, where chroniclers said the defenders lasted 7 years, feeding on dogs, cats, even shoes. Survival was not victory, it was simply delay. Looking at your city, you saw the same people surviving without purpose, without dignity, merely stretching time. And yet some clung fiercely to life, no matter the cost. A mother scraping lichen from stone walls, boiling it into bitter broth. A man catching rainwater in cupped hands, weeping with joy at a single swallow. Children chewing leather straps softened in fire. None of these acts saved them for long, but each gave them one more day. Desperation had stripped away pride, morality, humanity. What remained was raw existence bought at any price. By the 340th day, the city had descended past desperation into something even darker, survival at any cost. You saw the first true horror in a cellar. A neighbour invited you in eyes wild whispering of food. You followed, heart pounding. On a table lay a pot simmering. The smell was wrong, thick and sweet. When he lifted the lid, you recoiled. Inside was flesh, human flesh. He spoke quickly, desperately, insisting it was the only way. You fled, but his words clung to you. Better them than me. Better them than my children. Rumours spread of such acts. At first people denied them. Then they whispered. Then they admitted. Hunger does not listen to morality. Hunger rewrites it. You thought of Marat al-Numan, of the chronicler's horrified words that crusaders ate the flesh of the dead. You had thought it a fable, an insult hurled by enemies. Now you knew it was truth. The gangs too adapted. They collected bodies not to bury but to hoard. People said they boiled them, stripped them, divided them. No one dared to prove it. No one wanted to. But the whispers grew, and the city listened with horror and with hunger. Even those who did not cross that line paid the price of desperation. A father killed his last goat and fed his children. They lived 2 days longer. Then he wept as he lay beside their still bodies. A mother traded her daughter for bread. She ate. Her daughter never returned. Survival had a cost, and everyone paid in different currencies: dignity, family, sanity. By the 350th day, the city was unrecognizable. People crouched in ruins, gnawing on bones, staring blankly at nothing. Eyes were hollow cheeks, sunken voices gone. You walked through streets that felt like graveyards lined with the living dead. And still some clung to rituals of survival. Boiling weeds, catching vermin, licking condensation from stone. Small victories that bought another dawn. Desperation had made them inventive, but it had not saved them. It only prolonged the agony. By the 360th day, Survival was no longer about food at all. It was about choosing what kind of person you were willing to be. Some chose cruelty. They killed for scraps, hoarded for themselves, struck down anyone weaker. They lived longer, but their eyes were dead. Others chose sacrifice. They gave their last crumbs to children, their last breath to prayers. They died sooner, but with something of their humanity intact. You saw both every day. A man beating his neighbour for a rotten potato. A woman starving herself so her child could eat. The streets became a theatre of choices, each act of survival carving a soul into something smaller, something scarred. The gangs still ruled, but even they crumbled. Starvation thinned their ranks. Their violence became more frantic, more desperate. Their leaders boasted less and screamed more. Their power was no longer command, but terror brittle and close to breaking. The council no longer existed. Authority was gone. Faith was gone. Even fear of the enemy had dimmed. Only survival remained, like a drumbeat in every chest. Live, live, live. And yet in the midst of all this you saw flashes of something else. A mother breaking her bread in half for a stranger. A child guiding a blind man through the ruins. Tiny acts of humanity, sparks in the dark. They did not save the city, but they reminded you that desperation had not fully killed the human spirit. Still, the cost was written everywhere, in blood, in broken families, in haunted eyes. The city had survived 360 days, but survival had come at a price no one could ever repay. By the 370th day, the siege ended not with a final battle, but with surrender. The gates opened slowly creaking, like the ribs of a dying beast. The enemy marched in, but there was no fight left to meet them. The people were already conquered by hunger, by fear, by desperation. The invaders looked upon a city half dead. Corpses lay in the streets. Survivors stumbled like ghosts. Children clung to mothers too weak to stand. The victors scarcely needed swords. The city had destroyed itself. You thought of Jerusalem, 1,099 of Magdeburg, 1,631 of countless other sieges, where desperation hollowed out cities long before their walls fell. History had repeated itself line by line, scream by scream. And as you walked through the ruined streets, you realized the truth survival had not been victory. It had been surrender, stretched over days, weeks, months. Survival had eaten away honor, faith, community, humanity. It had left only bodies still breathing. The price of survival was too high. It was not measured in lives saved, but in lives destroyed in souls, broken in dignity lost. And when the enemy finally claimed the city, they claimed nothing worth having, Silion-only ashes, silence, and people who had already given up everything except the most fragile thread of breath. The collapse of walls and the final assault. By the 380th day, the walls still stood, but the people behind them had already fallen. Hunger had hollowed them, disease had broken them, fear had silenced them, and violence had torn them apart. The walls were tall, thick, ancient, but they were only stone, and stone cannot fight without men to defend it. The enemy knew this. They had waited with patience, sharper than any blade. They had starved the city, poisoned its wells, shattered its spirit. Now at last they prepared to finish what despair had begun. You stood on the battlements, staring out at the enemy camp. Fires burned in long rows. Soldiers moved like shadows, gathering weapons, assembling siege engines. The sound of hammers on wood carried through the night, steady and sure. Ladders, towers, rams, tools of destruction, rising like skeletons against the sky. Inside the city, no one believed in holding out anymore. The council was gone. The gangs were weakened. Families huddled in corners, not planning defense, but waiting for the end. The few soldiers who still climbed the walls looked like corpses themselves, armor hanging loose, eyes sunken. They leaned on spears, not from vigilance, but from exhaustion. One night the bombardment began. Stones hurled from trebuchets thundered against the walls. The city shook with each impact. Dust rained from ceilings, tiles shattered, houses collapsed. Children screamed, clinging to their mothers. Fires spread through districts already ruined, yet even then few ran to fight the flames. They were too weak, too broken. You thought of Constantinople 1453, when the great walls cracked under the thunder of cannon fire. Chroniclers wrote of the ground trembling, of towers collapsing, of defenders crushed beneath their own fortifications. Now you felt the same trembling beneath your feet, the same dread as ancient stone groaned under relentless assault. At dawn the enemy advanced. Siege towers rolled forward, their wheels grinding. Ladders clattered against walls. Arrows darkened the sky. From the battlements, defenders loosed what few arrows they had left. Some stones were dropped, some oil poured, but it was pitiful, scattered, uncoordinated. The defence was a shadow of what it had once been. You remember a boy beside you, no older than 16, clutching a bow. His hands shook so violently he dropped his arrow. He looked at you, tears streaking his face. "I don't want to die here," he whispered. Before you could answer, an arrow struck him in the chest. He fell without a sound. The walls, once a shield, had become a prison. There was nowhere left to run. The enemy climbed steadily, faces grim weapons ready, and you felt more than thought, this is the end. The second day of bombardment was worse than the first. At dawn the enemy's catapults hurled stone after stone. Each impact sent tremors through the wall cracks, splitting wider with every strike. Dust filled the air like smoke. People coughed eyes, watering ears, ringing from the thunder of impact. In the streets below, panic spread. Mothers dragged children into cellars, hoping stone ceilings could protect them. Men rushed to shore up walls with timber, but the timber splintered under the next barrage. The city groaned like a dying beast. You remember running with others to a collapsed district. A wall had crumbled there, burying homes beneath rubble. Survivors clawed at stones with bleeding hands, screaming the names of family trapped beneath. You pulled until your arms failed, but the cries from inside grew weaker, then stopped. Silence beneath the stones was worse than the screams. On the walls, defenders fought with desperation. They hurled stones, fired arrows, tipped boiling water over ladders, but their supplies were meagre. Arrows were few stones, scarce oil nearly gone. Some men hurled roof tiles, pots, even furniture, anything heavy enough to fall on climbing soldiers. It was not defence, it was survival. The enemy climbed regardless. You saw them swarming up, ladders, shields raised. Some fell crushed by stones, pierced by arrows, but more climbed behind them. Their persistence was terrifying. They were not merely fighting a battle. They were claiming inevitability. History burned in your mind. You thought of Jerusalem in 70 CE, when Roman battering rams broke the gates, and defenders fought in the streets, their courage drowned by sheer numbers. You thought of Constantinople 1453, when defenders too weary, too few, watched in despair as cannons carved breaches wide enough for armies to pour through. Now you saw those same patterns repeat in your city. One moment stays with you. A woman, her husband dead, stood on the battlements with a spear. Her hands bled from splinters, her hair wild, her face streaked with soot. She screamed like a warrior stabbing at the first man who reached the top. He fell, dragging the ladder with him. She raised the spear again, but an arrow struck her in the throat. She staggered, blood spraying, then collapsed into the dust. Her body was carried away on the tide of the enemy. By nightfall, breaches had opened. The walls, once invincible, now gaped with cracks. Stones lay shattered in heaps wide enough for 10 men to pass through. Fires burned where homes once stood. The city was bleeding, and no one could stop it. That night, silence fell for a moment. The bombardment paused. The people clung to the brief stillness, ears ringing, hearts racing. Then came the sound that shattered what little courage remained, the steady pounding of a battering ram against the gates. Each thud was a death knell. The wood splintered. Iron chains groaned. With every strike, people's eyes widened. Mothers wailed. Soldiers cursed. No prayer could drown the rhythm of destruction. You knew then that the walls would not stand another day. At dawn on the 390th day, the end came. The enemy advanced with ladders, rams, and towers. Arrows darkened the sky. Stones smashed into houses already crumbling. The gates splintered beneath the final blows, bursting open with a roar. The enemy poured in. Soldiers in iron faces, grim weapons drawn. Their cries echoed through the streets. The defenders fought, but they were too few, too weak, too broken. The walls had fallen not just in stone, but in spirit. You remember running through smoke-filled streets. Fires raged, houses collapsed. People screamed, scattered, trampled one another. Soldiers cut down anyone in their path. Men, women, children, it did not matter. The city had become a slaughterhouse. In one square, defenders made a last stand. They fought with swords, with clubs, with bare hands. Their courage was fierce but brief. The enemy cut them down in waves. The square filled with bodies, blood pooling in the stones. Their cries echoed against the walls until silence claimed them. You thought of Magdeburg 1631, when the sack left 20,000 dead in a single day. Chroniclers wrote of blood running in the streets of churches, burning of civilians, slaughtered without mercy. Your city was becoming Magdeburg reborn. The cathedral, once a sanctuary, was stormed, its doors shattered. Priests clung to the altar, praying until swords silenced them. Candles spilled igniting tapestries. Flames climbed toward the vaulted ceiling. The sacred had become ash. The last defenders retreated to the keep. They barred the doors, raising weapons with trembling hands. For hours they held out arrows flying from narrow slits, boiling water poured from above. But the enemy swarmed relentless. Smoke filled the keep, choking those inside. The doors splintered. The final defenders fell, their courage swallowed by numbers. By evening the city was gone. Fires burned in every quarter. Corpses filled the streets. Survivors were dragged from hiding, chained, beaten, enslaved. The enemy's banners rose above the walls. Trumpets blared victory, but it was not a victory, it was annihilation. You stood amid the ruins, trembling smoke stinging your eyes. You realized that the city had not fallen in a single day. It had fallen slowly over months of hunger, disease, fear, violence, despair. The final assault was only the last blow in a collapse long prepared. History would call it a siege. But you who lived it knew the truth. It was a slow death stretched into one final scream. Aftermath, ashes and lessons. When the siege ended, silence replaced the thunder of war. But it was not peace, it was emptiness. The city lay in ruins, not only in its walls and houses, but in its people. You walked through streets choked with smoke. Ash fell like snow coating, broken stones, shattered doors, burnt beams. Corpses lay unburied, twisted where they had fallen. Some still clutched weapons. Others clutched children. The air was heavy with the sweet, sickening stench of rot. Survivors stumbled like ghosts. Their eyes were vacant, their steps unsteady. They no longer ran, no longer fought. They had no strength left for anything but breathing. The enemy herded them together, men in chains, women pulled aside, children clinging to rags. Those who resisted were cut down. Those who submitted were dragged into slavery. The cathedral, once the city's heart, was blackened by fire. Its spire had fallen, lying like a broken spear across the square. Statues of saints lay headless. The altar was smeared with ash and blood. What had been sacred was now desecrated. People walked past without even bowing. Faith itself had burned away. You thought of Magdeburg in 1631, where chroniclers wrote of a heap of corpses, a sea of flames. You thought of Jerusalem in 1099, where the Crusaders waded ankle-deep in blood. History repeated itself with dreadful precision. When walls fell, what remained was not victory or defeat, but devastation. Some survivors searched the ruins for loved ones. You saw a woman clawing at rubble, pulling aside stones, until her fingers bled, whispering her son's name. When she found his body, she cradled him and did not move again. Another man walked the streets, calling for his wife until his voice broke. No one answered. The victors plundered what little remained. Gold and silver hidden in cellars were dragged into daylight. Clothing was stripped from corpses. Even wood from broken houses was carted away. The city was not merely defeated, it was consumed. But the worst ruin was invisible. It lived in the survivors' hearts. They no longer spoke of tomorrow. They no longer dreamed. They lived in silence, each carrying scars that would never heal. Days passed, though time itself felt broken. Smoke still hung in the air. Fires smouldered in ruins. The victors settled into the city, like carrion birds taking what they wished. Survivors adjusted not with hope, but with numb obedience. You remember the first attempt at rebuilding. A few men gathered in the square, speaking of clearing debris, of starting again. Their voices were thin, uncertain. When a gang of enemy soldiers passed, the men fell silent. Rebuilding was not possible. The city was no longer theirs. Children scavenged in the ashes. Some found trinkets, dolls, charred, black pots cracked by fire. They held them as treasures, though they had lost everything else. You saw one boy clutch a broken wooden sword, swinging it weakly, pretending still to be a knight. His mother pulled him close eyes, wet with grief. The victors imposed their rule quickly. Markets reopened, but only for them. Survivors were forced to sell what little remained for crumbs. Work was demanded, clearing rubble, carrying water, serving in enemy houses. Refusal meant death. The city had not escaped its prison. It had only traded walls of stone for chains of flesh. You thought of Carthage after Rome destroyed it, of how survivors were enslaved, their city salted so nothing would grow. You thought of Tenochtitlan in 1521, when Spanish conquerors rebuilt atop ruins, erasing an empire. Your city too would become a shadow, remembered not for life, but for death. At night, silence pressed harder than ever. There were no prayers, no hymns, no songs. Only the crackle of fires, the groans of the wounded, the muffled sobs of those who still had tears left. Many no longer wept. They stared at nothing, eyes hollow, and yet memory lingered. Survivors carried the story of the siege in their minds. They whispered of hunger, of plague, of betrayal, of walls that had stood, but hearts that had fallen. Their stories became warnings lessons, carved into the bone of history. Weeks turned into months. The ruins were slowly cleared, but the scars never vanished. Where once markets bustled, weeds grew. Where once children laughed, silence reigned. Where once towers stood, only broken stones remained. Survivors tried to rebuild, but they were no longer the same people. They carried the weight of choices made during hunger, the shame of violence done in desperation, the grief of families lost. They walked with haunted eyes. The city's stones could be rebuilt, but its soul could not. You thought of how history remembers sieges, numbers of dead dates of battles, names of conquerors. But living through it, you knew the truth. A siege is not just an event. It is a slow death. It kills the body with hunger, the mind with fear, the spirit with despair. It leaves survivors who are not truly alive, only breathing reminders of what was lost. One evening, you stood on the walls again. They were cracked, scorched, broken, but still standing. You looked out over the fields where the enemy camp had been. The fires were gone, the soldiers gone, but the land itself seemed scarred. You realized the siege had not ended. It would never end. It lived inside you. The lesson of the siege was not victory or defeat. It was fragility. That a city is more than stone and steel. It is trust, faith, community, hope. And once those are broken, walls cannot save it. History would write of your city's fall. Chroniclers would compare it to Jerusalem, to Magdeburg, to Constantinople, to every place where walls failed. But you knew the truth. The city did not fall when the gates opened. It fell long before, when hunger gnawed away kindness, when disease stole strength, when fear poisoned trust, when violence shattered unity, when hope died. What remained was only ash. And in those ashes lay the warning that no matter how tall the walls, no matter how strong the gates, a city is only as strong as the spirit of its people. And once that spirit breaks, nothing can save it. And so from hunger to ashes, the medieval siege reminds us not only of walls that crumble, but of people who broke long before the stones gave way. In these quiet ruins of medieval life, we find lessons that still echo of endurance, despair, and the fragile strength that allows humanity to survive even its darkest hours. Behind every fallen gate was a whisper of courage, a flicker of faith, a promise that the story was not yet over. If this quiet journey through medieval life spoke to you, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Sleepless Historian. Your support helps us continue bringing gentle, reflective stories that uncover the hidden truths of the past one night, one story, and one quiet heartbeat at a time.